This morning I saw a video get posted by Daniel Peters where he talks about the GH5 and how to fix the exposure drop when you are shooting at a higher frame rate or slow motion on the GH5. Now this is actually a problem I encountered on the GH5. Well, not necessarily a problem, but we'll get to that in a second. But the GH5, when you're shooting 1080, 120 frames a second, 180 frames a second in the variable frame rate modes, if your camera is configured a certain way with certain settings that we're going to get into, the exposure when you start recording will drop. It'll get darker. And Daniel goes about to talk about how to fix this, and there is a way to fix it, but he gets confused or he starts talking about stuff that is not 100% accurate. And this happens all the time, and it's in regards to shutter speed versus shutter angle. Now, I've made a bunch of videos talking about shutter angle and why I think it's so valuable and why I think you should use it. Much better videos than this one where I actually show examples of what the motion blur looks like and explain it in a little bit more detail. But before more misinformation gets spread around and people are still confused about the subject, I wanted to make a video quickly responding to Daniel's video and really trying to explain the difference between shutter speed and shutter angle. I know that this is a very common mistake that a lot of people make, but it's really important that you get it right so that you're not confused and that you fully understand exactly how these two things work, because they're very, very different. Even though they do the same thing, the way they work is very, very different on a fundamental level. So shutter speed, which is a photography term, it can be used for video, but shutter speed is a photography term. Shutter speed is a fixed point. It is a fixed speed that is always the same, irregardless of what resolution you're shooting, what frame rate you're shooting, what any of your other camera settings are. Your shutter speed will always be the same because it is a fixed speed. Think of it like a gun. If you fire a bullet out of a gun, that bullet is going to come out at a certain speed, at a certain velocity. And if you fire more rounds, they're going to keep coming out at the same speed. Aside from some small variations in, physical characteristics like maybe some deformity on the bullet or the air resistance or anything like that. But in general, if you have the same gun firing a set of bullets, they're all going to come out at relatively the same speed. It's fixed. It doesn't matter how fast that you pull the trigger. It doesn't matter how many bullets are in the gun. They're going to come out at the same speed. It's fixed. Shutter speed is a fixed amount. So if you set your camera to 1/200 or 1/500, it doesn't matter what frame rate you're shooting, doesn't matter what resolution you're shooting, it's always going to be that speed, how fast the shutter actually fires and how fast it closes. It's rated in seconds, so 1/50th of a second, 1/500th of a second. It's how fast the shutter closes. Shutter angle, on the other hand, is a ratio. It is not a fixed speed, so things affect it. It's a ratio. Think of it like this. If you are cooking in an oven, there are variables like elevation that determine how long you want to cook something, or how high of a temperature you want to cook something. So if you had an oven and you could tell it, hey, I want you to calculate my elevation so that no matter what I put in, when I put the casserole in, no matter what elevation I'm at, you always cook it the same way. Shutter angle is the same thing. It's a ratio, a correlation between two things. So what you input determines the output. So for the cooking example, if I put a casserole in at sea level, the oven is going to take that elevation into consideration, and it's going to calculate things like how long it should be cooked and what temperature it should be cooked, separate from what I'm doing, what I'm giving it. I'm just putting a casserole in the oven, and the oven's doing all the smart calculations. Let's say I go up to 10,000 feet elevation. I go up into the mountains. I put the same casserole in the oven. I want it to cook the exact same way. That oven is going to take that elevation into consideration. It's going to do all its calculations, and it's going to know the time it takes to cook it and the temperature at which to cook it, so it matches what was at sea level. We have two different elevations, two different variable inputs that we're putting in, and we're getting the same output or a similar output. Shutter angle is the same way. When you feed the frame rate into the camera, so you want to shoot at 24 frames a second. When you say 180-degree shutter angle, that's a ratio, and it's going to a calculation, and it's going to set the shutter speed for you. So the shutter angle isn't actually the speed, it's just the calculation or the correlation or the ratio between the frame rate and then what the shutter speed actually is, how fast it actually goes. The speed of the shutter is determined by that 180 degrees. Now, like I said, I've got other videos on this where I talk a little bit more about it, get into some of the math, but you really, really have to understand this, because one 180th shutter speed You know, 1/180, or if you set your camera to 180 shutter speed, is not the same as setting it to 180-degree shutter angle. They're very, very different. And in Daniel's video, he talks about how when he's shooting regular 24 frames a second, the shutter speed is set to 50, which is a calculation. The reason people set their shutter speed to 50 is because that's actually the shutter speed that you would get using the 180-degree shutter angle rule when you're shooting 24 frames a second. The quick and dirty math of that is just 1/2, the number 2, times your frame rate. So in this case, he's shooting 24 or he's shooting 25. I think he's actually in England. He's shooting 25 frames a second. So times 2 is 50. So he's actually doing shutter angle. He just has to do the math and put it into the camera and set the shutter speed to whatever he wants. But if he changes his frame rate, as we're doing when we're shooting slow motion, we're shooting 120 frames a second, 180 frames a second, you have to do the same calculation. So you have to multiply that frame rate by 2. It's very important that you do that. He switches to the slow motion mode and the camera defaults to 200, 1/200th of a second. And the reason it does that is because 1/200th is the lowest shutter speed that you can have when you're shooting 180 frames per second. Your shutter speed cannot be lower than your frame rate. So if you're shooting 180 frames a second, the slowest shutter speed you could have is 1/180. Technically you could, if the camera allowed you, you could go lower with your shutter speed, but then you'd be putting that exposure over multiple frames. So if you've seen a camera that lets you do that, where you can shoot with those slower shutter speeds at frame rates, you'll see you'll get a lot more motion blur, but it's spread over like 3 or 4 frames. So you're actually getting kind of like some chuggy, stuttery motion. Separate topic. So he says that, oh, it's proper to have 1/200th of a second as the shutter speed, but that's not true. When you set your camera, if you're GH5, if you're shooting, and you set it to 180 frames per second, your shutter speed, we have to do the calculation. It should be 1/360th of a second. 360th of a second for your shutter speed, because it's 180 times 2, which would be 360. So the camera is defaulting, when he switches the mode, it's defaulting to the bare minimum, but that's actually a 300-degree shutter angle. It's not the 180-degree shutter angle. So you really have to understand this stuff, understand the math, understand how it all works in relation to one another, because if you don't, you can end up thinking like, oh, you're shooting proper, your shutter speed's correct, but you have to actually set it. And what he does get right is that on the GH5, when you're in shutter angle mode, the camera, when you're previewing, is the 180-degree shutter angle is applying to that kind of base frame rate. So I believe it's like, if you're shooting 1080-24, 180 degrees is going to look like 1/50th of a second shutter speed is what it's going to look like. But the moment you pull the trigger and you start recording, it all of a sudden gets a higher frame rate mode, and because the input has changed, the frames that we're putting in has changed, that 180-degree shutter angle, if that's how you're set, the output in terms of the shutter speed and what the exposure looks like is going to drop down. So to fix that, you actually do, if you want to, you can switch back to shutter speed mode, the kind of more photography mode, and you can pick your hard fixed point of what you want your shutter speed to be. So if you're shooting 180 frames per second, your shutter should be set to 360. If you're shooting 120 frames a second, your shutter speed should be 240. You always have to do the math if you're doing shutter speed. You have to do the calculation. You have to understand what your input is, do the math for the camera, and tell it what to be. But it works well on the GH5 in that variable frame rate mode because it's that fixed point. So there's no fluctuation. Even though the frame rate is technically changing from the preview mode to the recording mode, the shutter speed is always the same. It's fixed. With the shutter angle, it actually looks like a bug or like something that's like a problem, but it's actually working the way it's intended. You're changing the frame rate on the fly, essentially, from that preview mode, starting to record. Now it's a new frame rate. Now 180 degree does the new calculation, and now it sets that new exposure, that new shutter speed. So really, really keep this stuff in mind. Look it up as much as you possibly can, because if you don't understand this, you can actually get put in situations where you're setting your shutter speed improperly or to the wrong thing. And like I said, this was a poor example of the video where I'm just talking about it. It's a lot more helpful to see examples, but I really wanted to get this out before more people were looking for a fix for this bug or whatever it is, and then they come across Daniel's video, and then all of a sudden they're confused, or they think they understand shutter angle versus shutter speed, and they don't. It's a very, very easy thing to miss, and a lot of people get it wrong, but it's important that you get it right. On a separate note, stay tuned for my cooking channel where I talk more about baking in different elevations. I'll see you then.